Hey, Push students, this is the fourth installment of Out with this COVID virus and doing work from home as we prepare for the AP exam here in 2020. And the notes that I took are a really simple note sheet, and at the end I'll show you something a little more detailed, which takes us from page 533 to 535 in AMSCO, and we're just going to talk about the impact of the war at home for different ethnic groups and women, and then talk a little bit about solidarity during the war, and then finish up with, if you look at the bottom, the election of 1944, which is an interesting election because something unprecedented happened. First of all, the war at home. As you see, I wrote left rural, rise of the Sun Belt. For the impact of the war affected every geographic area in the United States. People left the country for the cities, for factory jobs. So the people, the Americans that weren't serving in the armed forces, were leaving cities to work factory, or leaving the country, rural places, to work factory jobs, and many not return. In addition, many defense jobs were in the South, because the South was warmer and had lower labor costs. So we see a rise in what we call the Sun Belt. And the Sun Belt is an area of the country where, quite literally, it's warmer and sunnier. So we see this rise, that happens during World War II and after World War II into today, where people are leaving states like New York, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Massachusetts, and they're going to states like North and South Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida, and eventually Arizona, in Southern California, and Nevada, and Texas. And we see this shift in terms of the population of the United States, which has been taking place literally for the last, 80 years, okay? Now, as far as the war affected different minority groups, let's go through. For African Americans, 1.5 million, if you want to write that down, 1.5 million African Americans left the South for jobs. So first it was the Great Migration for the same purposes, and now during World War II we see another 1.5 million leave for jobs. 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces. They still face discrimination and segregation. The civil rights movement is still a generation away. There were race riots, particularly in New York City and Detroit, as blacks and whites clashed. African American civil rights leaders, however, believed in, if you look on the sheet there, the Double V campaign, which was victory over fascism abroad and victory for civil rights at home. And that's important. They'd hold up what we call the peace sign for the double V's, two peace signs for the Double V campaign. The NAACP grew in numbers, and a new group called CORE, which was created for racial equality, really took hold for African Americans in this war. There was an important Supreme Court case, Smith versus Allwright, that ruled that blacks could not be discriminated in terms of membership in political parties. So it was an important Supreme Court case for blacks. And really, the war set the stage for the end of segregation. Remember, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier 2 years after the war ends in 1947, and we start to see the chiseling away of segregation into Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which is only 9 years after the war ended. As far as Mexican Americans, 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the U.S. military for the United States, obviously. An agreement with Mexico allowed Mexican migrant workers to come into the United States to work. So the United States was asking for them to fill jobs that were vacant because of the war. They were known as braceros, and you can see the word right there, braceros. This led to rioting in Los Angeles between Mexican Americans, or Mexicans in this case, and the whites that were in the cities. And these are famously called the Zoot Suit Riots. There's even a song about it, Zoot Suit Riots, when I was a kid. Native Americans, American Indians, 25,000 served in the American military. In addition, many American Indians left for factory jobs, and over half of those that left never returned to the reservation, and they just assimilated into American life because of the war. The most famous of all of these immigrant groups in this era are the Japanese Americans. Because of the discrimination, they faced the most discrimination in World War II, more than any other group. 20,000 Japanese Americans served in the United States military, but nevertheless, after Pearl Harbor, many Americans looked at Japanese Americans as sneaky and as the enemy. And to look at it from a practical standpoint, I know that, I had a grandfather who had a German last name, Kufs, and another set of grandparents, Tortorello. They were Italian. The war was against Germany and Italy. And I know stories from both sides of my family that there was some low-key discrimination just based on the fact that we're fighting against Germany and Italy. Well, multiply that by the Japanese Americans, who obviously look different, and the way they were treated was horrific, particularly on the West Coast. Franklin Roosevelt's administration took 100,000 Japanese American immigrants and took 100,000 Japanese American citizens. These were not immigrants, and put them into what were internment camps in places like college dormitories. They weren't tortured. These were not concentration camps, but nevertheless, they were taken away from their family. One of them, a man named Korematsu, sued for his rights. In that landmark case, Korematsu versus the U.S., the federal government, much like the Schenck versus the U.S. decision in World War I, ruled in favor of the U.S. and said in wartime, civil liberties are limited. We feel like, as Americans, that sounds disgusting. And honestly, in 1988, Congress gave reparations. That means they paid those people that were locked up or their families, I believe, $75,000 each because of our guilt, because of that horrific decision by the Roosevelt administration that the Supreme Court upheld. So we regret the Korematsu decision, obviously. 200,000 women served in the Army, Navy, and Marines, all non-combat roles in the war. The influx of soldiers in World War II, much like World War I, led to women working in factory jobs. 24% of married women worked outside the home. This is a huge jump. Married women didn't work up until this point. But again, we're all contributing to the war effort here. And this is where you see the famous story and the song and the picture of Rosie the Riveter. And you can picture what Rosie the Riveter looks like, or look her up. That's encouraging women to work in the workforce. A lot of women took defense jobs. A note, women were still paid less than their male counterparts. One thing the war did was solidarity, wartime togetherness. The New Deal actually helped immigrant groups feel more welcomed in this country because everybody was in it together. In addition, they served. Italians served with Irish, served with English stock and origin, and served with different ethnicities throughout the war and called themselves, quote, bands of brothers, unquote, in combat. And these are your brothers that you served with. You didn't think about your ethnic differences or your religious differences. The fact that you were Roman Catholic and he was Protestant and he was a Jew, and it didn't matter because you were all in this together with a common enemy. Remember, we're fighting the Axis powers. We're fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan. We're fighting a war on two theaters. We'll talk about the battles next. We'll get into the different battles in those two different theaters of operation. But understand, as far as the American troops are concerned, it is a brotherhood. And it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. Now, an aside, African Americans are still in segregated units and will be up until 1948. Okay, and the war ends in 45. Lastly, Franklin Roosevelt served a fourth term. He now has a different vice president. He picks Harry Truman from Missouri, a little bit less radical than the one he had before. It was the closest election that FDR had. He only got 53% of the vote. I say only. He defeated another New Yorker, the governor of New York, a Republican named Thomas Dewey, who would be famous for the next election where he challenges Truman and loses. But FDR will die in 1945, so he'll only serve 12 years and 3 months. He won't serve the full 4 terms, the unprecedented 4 terms. So just to wrap things up, I have a more detailed note sheet. If you're inclined that you like to have a little bit more detail, I know my screen's a little fuzzy here, but this is a more detailed note sheet. I don't know if this can focus better. And you can see